they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. If you don't think man has the ability to thwart God's will, that is an example where they did. God, told Samuel, because Samuel felt like they were turning on him, and God said, no, not at all. They're turning on me. They are rejecting me. And that wasn't the Amalekites or the Hittites or the Jebusites. That was Israelites. That was his chosen people turning their back on God. Now, very quickly, we've got to move a little bit. Luke 13:34. Luke 13:34. And it's on the screen. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills, this is Jesus talking, the ones who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. What did Jesus want to do? Gather the children of Israel to himself. He had been there teaching them and telling them he was come sent from God. He said, I would have gathered you unto myself, but you were not willing. Who was not willing? Those people weren't willing. It had nothing to do with the will of God. Jesus said, I wanted to gather you to myself, and they said no. Friends, you and I have the God-given ability to say no to God. It's really, the Bible's so full of that it's crazy. But here's two prime examples of people rejecting God's will. And like in the case of 1 Samuel, the will of God's will in the case of 1 Samuel and the will of Jesus in the Matthew text. So, how do we need to see God? That's my last point. How do we need to see God? How do we understand then, as it says to do in Ephesians 5:17, to not be unwise, but to understand what the will of the Lord is? I hope this will really make it clear to you. God has a perfect will. If you're struggling with what I'm saying, write this down somewhere. God has a perfect will. That would fit into the text in Jeremiah. I know the plans I have for you, saith the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. That's God's perfect will for your life. But most of us have lived imperfect lives, and so we wonder what's going on. Let me give you now my example for that, 2 Peter 3:9. You know this verse very well, but let's look at it. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. All right. How many of you, based on 2 Peter 3:9, believe that God would plan and will that every man alive should come to salvation? Raise your hand. We're just reading that verse right off the wall. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, meaning that he's waited. Why doesn't the Lord come back? Why doesn't he come back and get me out of this trouble I'm in? He's saving people. I said this last week or week before, I don't know. In 1 year, the Church of the Nazarene planted 1,100 new churches in Ethiopia. 1,100 new churches in Ethiopia, one country in Africa. Over 1,000 new churches, not 1,000 converts, 1,000 new churches. And we go, what's God doing? Open your eyes and see what God's doing. He's at work. We're saying, come get us out of here, God. And he's going, man, if I come now, some of those people are going to be lost forever. I need to wait and try to get more people saved. Pretty amazing. So if you read that and agree, it is God's will that all should come to repentance. Everybody ought to get saved. That's God's will. That is his perfect will. But, well, let me just ask you, how many of you believe every person's going to go to heaven? I'm not going to wait very long. I'm just going to kind of glance around. I told them the other day, I had a lady tell me that one time. I was preaching in Brooklyn, Iowa. That's probably all the information I'll give on that. Some of you have some cousin in Brooklyn. You'll be on the phone. I preached in that. It was a very little church, and I had preached a sermon basically saying that I did not believe in universalism, that everybody wasn't going to go to heaven, and that it was our job to win people. And I went to the back, stood by the little set of double doors, and this woman came down that aisle. I ain't saying she looked like a football player, but she looked like a football player's sister. Man, this woman was wide. She was big. She walked like that, and I was there, and she said, and I was like, and I was up against a door. I couldn't even run. I could have made it go. She'd have got me. She'd have tackled me. She got up in my face about that far away, and she said, if God is love, there will be no hell. And I was like, that's very interesting. See, she said it's God's job to fix everything. Because if He is a God of love, no one can say no. He's going to love them all into heaven. And I said, that would be universalism, what I just preached. And then I realized why she was mad at me. And I was like, oh. I said, well, I agree with you, really. I just preached that but I agree with you. Anything to make you back up 2 steps will do right now. I didn't say that. I told her the love of God's never saved anybody, ever. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. God loving us isn't the issue or question. It's us responding to God. And when you don't, you've said no to His love and His grace and His mercy and His salvation. You've said no to all that and then turn around and blame God and say, what are you doing? Why is my life going the way it is? Oh, wow. Let's read the last one and then we'll go eat lunch. What do you think? Y'all ready to eat lunch? Or would you rather listen to me preach 2 more hours? Don't answer that. Either way, actually, don't answer that question. I love this, so I want people to understand that you can't blame God. You cannot blame God, and that's what it comes down to. I'm going to read 3 verses pretty rapidly. Matthew 7, 13 and 14 and 21. This is what Jesus said. Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because, did you get that? Many go the way of destruction, which means the will of God is being thwarted by people who don't go. God's will is being thwarted. His will is that everyone should come to repentance, but Jesus said everybody's not going to, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Our responsibility. Do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Verse 21 then, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. It is all about the will of God, but it is all about us finding and doing the will of God. That's really easy. So then, does God have a wonderful plan for your life? Yes, He does. If you're living in that, don't sit back and blame God, saying He isn't doing His part. God may be ready and waiting to bless your life if you do your part. You see, God has a perfect will, but He has a permissive will. God has a perfect, wonderful plan, but the permissive will of God says, but you choose.